If you think corporations bought free speech before, now that they're human, they'll buy even more. Yeah, their money has free speech.
Hello and welcome to the Alliance for Democracy's The Populist Dialogues. This is a special production of our what used to be a regular weekly program. And the Alliance for Democracy is dedicated to ending corporate domination. Our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Simon. Dr. Simon is the Executive Director of the Election Defense Alliance, a nonprofit organization founded in 2006 to restore observable vote counting and electoral integrity as the basis of American democracy. As a result of his prior experience as a political survey research analyst in Washington, Dr. Simon became an early advocate for an exit poll-based electoral quote-unquote burglar alarm system, independent of media and corporate control to detect computerized vote shifting in election 2004. Dr. Simon has authored numerous papers and appeared in several films, including Stealing America, Vote by Vote, and Uncounted, the new math of American elections. He's a graduate of Harvard College, New York University School of Law. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Nice
So just for those who may not know, and I would guess that probably most Americans have no idea what electoral integrity means.
Well, electoral integrity refers to elections that you can trust, that when you find out what the results are, you have reason to believe, very strong reason to believe, that those results reflect the input, the will of the voting public, that the intent of that public has been translated accurately and honestly into results, and the people who have been elected reflect the choices of the people who have been doing the voting. And of course, our concern with electoral integrity is that there's not enough of it, and that the vote counting process is vulnerable to manipulation.
Okay, good. Yeah. So you have reason to think that, in fact, in the United States, we have a problem with regard to electoral integrity.
We have a big problem with regard to electoral integrity. And again, there are many aspects of electoral integrity aside from the vote counting process. There's the infiltration of money into politics. There's voter ID issues and voter suppression. There's gerrymandering. There's all sorts of false messaging. But the vote counting process is really at the core of all of this. If you can't count the votes honestly, then all those other aspects are almost secondary. And our vote counting process in the United States of America, the world-renowned beacon of democracy, is an unobservable process. It's concealed, and since the start of this century has been done almost exclusively on computers that are owned, operated, programmed, serviced, maintained by corporations, and just a handful of corporations with very strong partisan affiliations, and that is a very vulnerable system. And about the vulnerability of the system, I think there's very little dispute among experts. Johns Hopkins, Princeton, Caltech, MIT, various states, the federal GAO have all done research into this and have basically reached the conclusion that one person or a very small group of people can change the results of hundreds of elections without leaving a trace through the computers.
Okay. And can you give us an idea how they would do that?
Well, there are many ways of skinning the cat. Apologies to cat lovers. And inside these computers, now whether you have a touchscreen computer where you touch the screen and it records your vote, or you have an optical scanner, which is you fill out a ballot and pop it into the scanner and it scans your votes. Either one, they're both computers, and they both have memory cards on them that control the function of those computers. And on those memory cards are upwards of 500,000 lines of code, tremendous length of code to make it possible to count these votes by computer. And by adding just a few lines of code, 3 or 4 lines of code, you can, for instance, for one example, offset the zero counters on those memory cards. And what a zero counter is it's the number assigned to the first ballot of the day. And if you, let's say, offset the zero counters for candidate A to plus 100 and candidate B to minus 100, okay, candidate A's first ballot is going to be recorded as 101, and candidate B's first ballot is going to be minus 99. At the end of the day, if they each get 500 actual votes, candidate A is going to be showing 600 votes, candidate B is going to be showing 400 votes. You will have shifted a net of 200 votes per machine, so rigged. And at the end of the day, also, that machine's going to be showing a total of 1,000 votes because you offset. One was plus and one was minus, the same amount. So the election administrator looks at it, says, that's the right number of voters. That reflects the number of voters who signed in. Clean election, stamped, certified, all good. And nobody would be the wiser. Nobody would ever see those memory cards. And in fact, in the case of optical scanners, nobody, with almost, literally a handful of exceptions out of thousands and thousands of elections over the past 10 to 15 years, nobody ever gets to see the actual voter marked ballots. They're all off limit to inspection, investigation. If they were footballs, we'd be impounding them and checking the air pressure. But this is our electoral system, and unlike apparently football, it's not important enough from a cultural standpoint to apply that level of scrutiny that would be necessary to be able to observe the process or audit the process or know that it was done honestly and accurately.
Okay, those are serious. In spite of the fact that you say that this could happen, is there any evidence that that has happened?
There is plenty of evidence that it has happened, and that's of course where you get into the more the stickier wickets, because the vulnerability, as I said, is basically indisputable, and the idea that we have an unobservable vote counting system should strike people on its face as insane. And I use a very simple analogy there. If we were having an election and the mode of vote counting in this election, everybody was in a room, they filled out their ballots, they handed their ballots to a man dressed in a magician's suit, who then took them behind a curtain, came out half hour later, said, I've shredded them and counted them and so has won, we would be very reluctant to accept the results of that election as being legitimate. And that's exactly what's happening within the computers. So the vulnerability is really something that should stick with us, and we should say, we need an observable counting process, irrespective of any proof of fraud, actual fraud. That having been said, there are mountains of forensic evidence ranging from exit poll related, pre-election polls, hand counts, all sorts of baselines, all sorts of patterns of results in this computerized election age, which dates back to about 2000, which are red flagged. They do not fit statistical expectations, one after another, and they're all, literally all, in the same direction, which is what we call the red shift, where the vote counts are coming out to the right, favoring the right-wing candidates relative to exit polls, pre-election polls, post-election polls, hand counts, and we see differentials where elections are competitive versus when they're non-competitive. Non-competitive election is presumptively not a target for manipulation because it would not pass the smell test to shift 40% of the votes in a given election if the margin of that election were 35%. It's close elections. And what we find, and we've done a lot of forensic work on this, is that there is a differential, and the competitive elections show, relatively speaking, far more red shift than non-competitive elections. We see a very, very sharp bimodal pattern there. And that's, I use the word pathognomonic, a medical term. It's absolutely symptomatic of targeted manipulation, that these elections have been selected for vote count shifting, and it's the competitive ones that have national significance. National significance, not necessarily the presidential election. It could be a state legislature in a swing state. You take over that state legislature, you then pass gerrymandering laws, you pass voter suppression laws, et cetera, and you take control of the infrastructure of the electoral process, and that is exactly what we've seen happen over the past half dozen or so biennial elections, especially the down ballot elections for the House and for the state legislatures, taking control of that infrastructure, which now is basically almost fully in the competitive states, in the swing states of this country, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, Virginia, has gone into the hands of the right wing. We now have, from an infrastructural standpoint, the country is more Republican than at any time since Herbert Hoover was president. That doesn't seem to reflect anything that we find in opinion polls or just taking the temperature of the American public. It doesn't fit with this political control that has come in through this vote counting process.
And I think you have talked about the fact that in non-candidate elections, like initiatives and referendums, the evidence is pretty clear that the electorate is pretty liberal.
We saw something very odd and egregious in the past election in 2014, and that was that on these initiatives, and they could involve public health measures, medical marijuana, protection of the environment, gun safety measures, minimum wage, so income redistribution. There was a very strong showing of what appeared to be progressive voters, and these measures passed, including many in states that you would consider to be red states or purple states. We're not talking only California and Massachusetts here. We're talking about heartland states, and they passed by wide margins. As a matter of fact, margins so wide that it would have been very difficult to reverse the outcome by rigging. Average, I think, of about 25% margins across the board. And yet at the same time, in the elections for candidates, we saw just the opposite. We saw a congressional approval rating coming into this midterm election of about 6%, abysmally low. And it had been that since the Republicans took over in 2010, in another very, very suspect election from a forensic standpoint. And this approval rating dropped in the spring of 2011 once they began, the Republican House began doing various obstructionist things, and it dropped into the single digits, and it remained that way. So you had, going into 2014, abysmal congressional approval rating, including, for the first time, we saw a plurality of voters saying their own representative did not deserve re-election. We had never seen that before in the whole time that it's been polled the past 40 or 50 years. And so it was a throw the bums out election if going in as if you've ever seen one. And what we found, taking the U.S. House, for example, out of 222 Republican incumbents in the U.S. House, exactly 2 lost their seats. This was unfathomable relative to all the other indicators. They also took over the Senate, they took over more state houses, they took over more governorships. It turned out to be one of those elections where everybody afterwards was, the pundits, the Washington Corps was scratching their heads and saying, what happened? How could this happen? John Nichols famously said, well, writing for The Nation, the voters, there were all these voters and they approved all these progressive measures, all these ballot initiatives. They just didn't elect Democrats. And this was just accepted at face value, which is typical of the response of the mainstream media and to a large extent of the progressive media. You see things that you raise the eyebrows very high on the forehead and just find any old benign explanation and move on. No investigation of a vote counting system which is a priori absolutely suspect and understood to be vulnerable. And we're taking it on 100% blind faith, giving it full faith and credit that system is doing an accurate and honest job of counting the votes, when we know that the stakes of no sport, no game, no money situation, in Wall Street are higher than that involved in American national elections. And we are in an age where just win, baby, is the mantra. If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. And it's vulnerable. You have certainly a cadre of potential manipulators who are extremely motivated, and you have these red flag results election after election, and yet we're just moving on and accepting this, what looks like a diversion and a perversion of history and of our future. We need an electoral system that we can trust to translate the will of a majority. We are a democracy, majority rule democracy, of a majority of the public into elected leaders in a way that is observable, so that we can trust it. Whether that entails hand counting the ballots, as they do in several other countries and in a few pockets still in America. It's not impossible. We've done it for generations. It is seemingly Luddite in the computer age, but we're also finding out that there's a lot going on in the computer age that makes the hair stand on end. So whether it entails hand counting ballots or a scrupulous and well-designed audit system that allows us to sort of have quasi-observability and would act as a deterrent to election theft. Right now, we have almost no deterrent in most of the places in this country, including the ones that determine national control. And we need something that is observable so that we can actually observe ballots being counted ourselves, or our people that we trust could be there observing them. It's a public trust. And right now it's been absolutely privatized, absolutely corporatized, and there is no access to memory cards, to ballots, to the code that goes into the computers. This is a black box system, and that should give us all the willies at the very least.
Yeah. So this lack of access, is that because cities and states and counties have not demanded when they've purchased the machines? Have they just not demanded to have access, or are there copyright laws, or
It's a combination of all of that and more. Our country is very corporate protected.
I want to interrupt you for a minute, because I just realized that in the introduction, I neglected to say that Jonathan has written a book called Code Red, Computerized Election Theft and the New American Century. And it's important to note this, because that's one of the reasons why you're here, is because we're talking about what you've said in this book. And this book is written in it's a very reader-friendly style. It's a question and answer. So the questions you might ask about this issue are then asked and answered, and all of the backup documentation is separate in the back portion of the book. So you can get the narrative without getting bogged down in all the data, but it's there if you need it. So I just wanted to be sure that people realize you've written this book, Code Red, Computerized Election Theft in the New American Century. Yes. So thank you.
Thanks, David.
Sorry to interrupt you.
And it's available on Amazon, and it's also has a website associated with it called Code Red 2014,
Right.
where there's a lot of information
Right.
about the book and about electoral integrity. You were saying, how do we wind up with this system? It's a long story. Unfortunately, it would take a long time to go into it. Election administrators, by and large, they are allergic to controversy. They don't want to look into the sausage very much. They just want smooth elections where the numbers come up and they report them, and that is as far as it goes. So there's a great deal of resistance among election administrators. There are a few in the country that, in our view, do it right, that actually pull the ballot. There's one in New York State, one county in New York State. They actually pulled, the Republican and Democratic co-commissioners have agreed, and they pull the ballots out of the OpScan and count them fully by hand after the OpScan has done its initial count. But that is the very, very rare exception to the rule. And for the most part, we've been seduced. Convenience, expediency, sleekness, technology have been very seductive in our culture at large, as a whole. There's
And
some
of course,
pushback.
we almost demand to know at 8 o'clock when the polls close or 10 minutes after who has won and who has lost.
Yeah, the impatience. I mean, we're used to getting everything within milliseconds, faster downloads, faster uploads, faster everything. There's some pushback against that. Obviously, there's the slow food movement, and there are people who want to walk to work instead of, driving, et cetera, et cetera. And there's quite a bit of pushback, and I expect that there will be more. The idea is to sort of intersect that with the area of voting, take a look at voting and say, well, is this something where getting the results by 8 p.m. is somehow more important than actually having a verified election where you can trust the vote counting process? I mean, we're going to get the results by 8 p.m., but if they basically are fraudulent, where is that getting us? So, the idea of hand counting ballots is, strikes many people as being very Luddite. I mean, we never go backwards. And we may be learning that sometimes we have to go backwards. We have to look at what the appropriate technology is. An IT professional quite a few years ago, at that sort of the dawn of this computer age, named Chuck Herron, he put it brilliantly. He said, it takes a long time to change 10,000 ballots by hand. It takes me 3 seconds to do it in a computer. And that's what we've got. There's always been incentive to manipulate elections. There's always been election fraud. What we've done is we've made it systematized, and we've made it an insider job where the capacity to do it in a broad way, where it affects the balance of political balance of power in the country, has sprung up with this computerization process. And we should also note, we just had a recent hack of the federal government, ostensibly originating from China. Our computerized vote counting system is also very vulnerable to outside hacking, and we probably wouldn't want the Chinese determining who the next president or who various senators were in our country. We take umbrage at that idea. We have to be aware that we have a computerized system that is far, far less secure than even those government and International Monetary Fund and central bank systems and Citibank and it's the Pentagon that have all been hacked into successfully from the outside. And that's just looking at the hackers. Probably the greater danger here are the insiders. There is no secret that the corporations ranging from Dominion to ES&S to Hart Intercivic, these are right-wing affiliated corporations, and they are counting the votes for America. And the media is going along with the game and accepting this as Operation Normal. And we're getting these results, and we're now in a country that seems, something seems to be wrong with the picture politically. I mean, we're not being represented. A lot of attention is being paid to the overt reasons for that, and voter suppression, gerrymandering, but very, very little attention to the actual vote counting process, and that is really at the core of electoral integrity.
Right. Yeah. So we've got just a couple of minutes left. What is the message that you want to send to our viewers, real succinctly?
Well, read my book and spread the word. We are, we banged our head against this wall for a long time and not gotten a response out of the political system, not gotten a response out of the journalistic system, which is, largely corporate owned and operated at this point. This is going to have to come from the people. It's going to have to come from individuals becoming informed and then communicating and connecting with one another in a kind of congregation or community. And that begins with you build a foundation that enables public pressure and public action. This is what our populist tradition is about. It's going to take a lot of pressure because the inertias to maintain the system as it is are extremely great. So the word has to be spread, the awareness has to be spread, and then the determination to act and the tenacity to keep acting has to be spread person to person, group to group. I think Code Red is a good vehicle for that. Because, as you said, it's reader friendly. It's the kind of thing that won't make people's eyes glaze over. It tells a story with factual backup. So the idea would be to, if you read the book and if you find it compelling, don't stop there. Bring it to a friend, bring it to family, bring it to colleagues, and get them involved, because that's what we need. We need a lot of connection. Then we need to apply that pressure at the places where the system can be responsive, if there is that great foundation of public pressure.
Okay. And I will point out also that you created an election defense alliance.
Yes.
And talk about that for like 30 seconds.
Okay, that's a nonprofit organization. We launched it on July 4th, 2006, to further the cause of electoral integrity and particularly of observable vote counting in our elections. And we are an active organization. There are other organizations. It is an uphill battle to get the kind of backing and the kind of interest that, for instance, you'd see in the civil rights movement or in the gay rights movement, a lot of the identity politics. But we're in there and we're fighting. We need to do more.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, David. It's been a pleasure.
Good. So today we've been talking with Dr. Jonathan Simon, Executive Director of the Election Defense Alliance, which seeks to expose election fraud and restore electoral integrity to the foundation of American democracy. Learn more at www.electiondefensealliance.org. And for the website specifically for his new book, go to www.codered2014.org.
.com.
Excuse me, yes, .com. Let me do that again. www.codered2014.com. This program sponsor is the Alliance for Democracy. Learn more about the Alliance for Democracy at afd-pdx.org in Portland, or our national website, thealliancefordemocracy.org. Thanks today to our crew. That's Roger Bates, Dave King, Brad Leach, and Tom Thomas. We wouldn't be on the air without them. And I hope that we'll see you again sometime when we produce another special edition of the Populist Dialogues.
If you think corporations bought free speech before, now that they're human, they'll buy even more. Yeah, their money has free speech, to me quite a shock, 'cause I never heard my money talk. When a corporation has a colonoscopy, then I'll believe they're human like me.